Hello and welcome to this session where we continue developing the design template and understanding how to create interactions with our users. Today we look into the datasets section of this template, and here we can see a kind of Microsoft Outlook inspired interface where we can choose the company on the left here, and then that brings up a list of employees. And then by clicking on that employees list, we can edit the employee details. There's also this companies editor here, and that shows us how we can edit the company names. Now, this is just an example. It's just intended to help us understand how to create this kind of interface, which is rather an important one when we're dealing with data from the database and we want to be able to grant our users the ability to edit data in a database. So towards that, we are going to look into the show datasets method in the class. And before we get into that, though, we have to look at the data creation itself. And just to explain that this is not typically what the front-end design person would do. So if you are developing this in a team of people, so if you are working in a team of people where you have a dedicated person for the user interface design, then that person won't typically be involved in structuring the database and so on. So typically this step where we create the data, that would be handled by the person who's involved with laying out the database and so on. And it's always a good practice to create a sample of the data. So instead of going straight into designing the database and loading that with sample data, you can actually generate data on the fly. So you can generate data using code rather than having to go all the way into a database. So you create init sample where you generate the data, and then once that data is available, the user interface person just needs to understand what data there is, and then if they understand the contents of the present video where we look at combining the data sets and creating an interface, if you have a person like that, then that person would take over from that data set and be able to design the interface. And that allows you to split roles so that the person who's involved in structuring the database, they can keep working on that while the interface is being developed. So anyway, here's the code that generates the sample of data. And you can see here that number one, we are instantiating a class. So randgen helps automate the process of creating sample sets of data. And here we can see the first data set being created. So here rg.genbm, so this generates a blue matrix. So matrix blue, remember the company name NanoStream Blue, so this is a matrix. It's much like the pandas. So those of you from the Python background, this is like the pandas style of creating tables of data. So in creating this randomly generated table, we are creating just 5 rows, and there are 2 columns. So CC name, so obviously the name of the company, and then base city, so where the company is based. And here in using this randgen class, that class has a list of company names and it has a list of city names. And so here in creating the company, if you say the field of company name can be found from the list company, and then the field of base city can be found in the list city, then that's going to generate for us a matrix with 5 rows, and those are the 2 columns in that table. Okay, so that's created now a list of companies, and now we want to create the list of employees here. So we go ahead and use the same class and use the same method, genbm, and we are creating now 5 columns, and the employee has a last name and first name and a user ID. So here we are deriving the user ID from the last name and first names that have been generated. So instead of specifying that the field is obtained by looking up from a list, we now specify that the field is obtained via this function. And in this function, there will be this val. So if you include a function with an argument here, then the system will run through each column and create values, and then those values will be available in this object val. So you'll have access to val.lastName. So for the current row, there's a certain last name and a certain first name, and there's also a certain index, so IDX, that's generated on the fly. So it's linearly spaceless. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's intended obviously to be like your auto incrementing index. So you have available that index, and so here we are generating this user ID. Then for the email, of course, we want first name dot last name at, and here it's looking up the domain name for the company. So and unfortunately, it's actually not looking up the domain name, right? We haven't specified as yet any company name, so we are just randomly choosing a company domain name. So that's why the domain name doesn't really correspond to the company, as we'll see just now. So that's your email, and then your company ID is just a randomly chosen company. So here we know we have 5 companies in the list. So if you read this code, you'll see that we are looking up the number of rows in company, and then we are randomly generating a number. So 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So that's the company ID. So it's just the index that corresponds to a certain row in the company's data set. And that's it. That's all the data. Obviously, in other systems, it's much more complex than this, and you have many more tables. But for illustrating what we will now, it's sufficient to go with just these 2 tables. So in this init sample, it's going to create users and companies, or rather employees and companies. So those are 2 tables that are available right now. And let's see, where does init sample run? So that runs in the constructor. So when we first create this UE set, that data set is going to be created and stored in an attribute data stash. Okay, so that's the first step, just creating some tables of data. And now let's look at creating the interface for that. So we know we have a companies list and a user and an employees list. So let's look at creating this fairly sophisticated interface now. And you see, the bulk of the work is done because we have this method add table editor created. But anyway, we'll get to that. Let's look at the layout for this first. So of course, we've created a method here, show data sets. And if you go back to the overall framework, remember we have under main tabs, we have one of those as data, and that's our data sets, and we've just randomly used the dog icon there. So we are talking about this thing, right? So we are referencing this tab, and so here when we call show data sets, you can see here show data sets. You can see here we are referencing the data tab. And this time, in addition to the viewport, in addition to specifying the viewport, we also have to send in the data that we are going to send into this show data sets. So we include the attribute data, and we know that we've stored our data in data stash. So that's what we are creating there. And then looking here at show data sets, we can see that, of course, number one, we just pull up the reference to the viewport, which is the data tab. And then in there, we are adding an accordion, so for editors and raw data. And so you may not have noticed that yet, but everything we are talking about here is wrapped inside a panel in an accordion. So if we click here, you can see there's a raw data tab as well. So this is just if you want to view all the data that has been created, you can do that here. So anyway, let's go back to the editor. And you can see the first step is, right, we've created that accordion with editors and the raw data. So let's talk about the editors section. So in the editors section, we create a 2-column grid. So there's a small left column, and the mid one is the larger. So it's I think it's a proportion of 3 and 9. It might be 4 and 8 or 3 and 9. Right, remember we said the bootstrap column paradigm was 12 columns, so it's either a 3 by 9 or 4 by 8. So anyway, we create a grid there, and then on the right hand side we create a tab set of employees and company editor. So you can see on the right hand side, employees and company editor, and here obviously I've customized the labels. So you can see the labels there. So we've got that set of tabs on the right, and then we are creating, well, this is the raw data section. So I'm going to come back to that. Well, actually, this is not the raw data section. So it's incorrect comment here. So this is the editors section. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is just stick in the employees. So we are first adding in this this interface, and this is handled quite easily, as we mentioned, using this add table editor method. So in the data, remember we sent in the data users, so it's users and companies. Right, so we sent that into show data sets. Remember when we called on create UE, we sent that in here. So we sent in 2 attributes, viewport and data contained users and companies. So if we look here, we are looking up the data attribute in settings and looking up the users. So this is the table of users. And then that table, the blue, it's a blue matrix table, remember, that has the method add table editor. And all we have to do is provide a few settings, and it goes ahead and draws this thing. So let's look at some of the settings there. Number one, we just give it a title, and you can see the title users up here, which we should change to employees, of course. And then we are specifying where to draw this table editor. So we have to specify in CC tabs. There's a tab called employees. So that's what we've done here. And then we have to specify a method for creating the title. So you see in these selectors here, you can see a title of the selector, and then there's some text down here. So we want to specify that we want to create a title, and you see in JavaScript, this is what you can do to create a sophisticated string. So you use these backticks, right? This you can get on your keyboard. It's next to the letter 1, next to the number 1. So if you look up on your row of numbers, so I'm not talking about the number pad on the side, on the right side. I'm talking about on the row of numbers. If you look to the left of the number 1, you'll find a key with a backtick and with a tilde. So here I'm talking about using the backtick. So if you use backticks, right, so you enclose your intended string in backticks, and then you want to access values in here. So if you type any text inside there, then that will render as normal text. But if you want to substitute text with the value of a variable, then you use $ and then curly brackets, and then you provide the variable name in there. So this function is going to look up for each row, right? So when we say add table editor and we provide this function, the method is going to run through all the rows in the data table, and each time it runs through a row, it's going to create an object. So vals is an object, and we know that in the users table, it has last name, it has first names, and so you can go back to your init sample. So we have last name, first names, user ID, email, company ID. So you can see here it's using the last name and first names. And so we want to say last name, comma, first names. So using the string, we can generate the title in this way. And you can see that's what it's done here, last name, comma, first name. Last name, comma, first name for each of the rows in the table. And by the way, we generated more names than this. It's just that because we've selected a particular company, it's giving us the list of employees in that company. So those are, well, that's the method for generating a string like that. Then here, when we specify another function called table body, then in the body of the selector, it's going to use that function to create this text. And in this case, we just specified the email. So we don't want anything except the email address here. And so that's what it's showing there. And of course, this part you can customize, and you can edit this as much as you like and include as much information as you like in the title and the body. Okay, so that's the employees section. So you can see we create an editor like so. And that doesn't yet answer the question, how did we generate specifically the list of employees from a specific company? And to answer that, we go here to the next section. So now we want to create the company's editor. And so we use the same approach. So first off, we reference the data set, so the company's data set. And then that is going to have an add table editor method. And in there, we specify a title, and now we specify a form port and a select port. Now this is different to what we did up here. Here we just specified a viewport. We specified one port, and it went ahead and it knew that if we just specify one viewport, then it needs to put a selector on the left and the editor on the right. And by the way, I forgot to mention about this editor, but we'll come back to that just now. So it's figured out that that's what it needs to do. In this case, when we specify the form port and the select port, so we don't specify a viewport in this case, we specify a form port and a select port, then we are being more specific. So when we create the employees editor, we just specified a viewport, so it had to figure out where to put the form and where to put the selector. And in this case, with the companies, we don't want the company list and the editor for the company side by side, right? We want to put the selector for the companies here, and then we want next to that the selector for the employees. So we have to figure out how to stick the company selector here and then the company editor there. So the way we did that was we first created the grid. So the grid was left and mid, and then we created in mid, we created these tabs, employees and companies editor. So we want to stick the company's selector in this left panel, and we want to stick the editor form in this tab, in companies editor tab. And so the way we are doing that is specifying the form port, and we can see we want the form for the companies editor in the set of tabs, in CC tabs. Remember, CC tabs, employees and company editor. So in CC tabs, in the company editor tab, we are sticking the form port. So the form is going to go there, and then the select port, you can see, is on the left of that of the wrapper grid. So that's how we can be more specific about where to position the elements of these editors. And as I mentioned, I forgot to talk about this the form itself. So you see, if you want to edit your employees, then this form is here on the right hand side. And if you hover over this, this is create. So if you want to create a new employee, you would go ahead, specify the values here and click on create. If you want to find a specific employee, then you can click on this one. So you specify whatever values you know you are looking for, and you click on that. And then if you want to change the details, so if you've made a mistake with the names, or you want to change the email address or something, you change it on the form, and then you click update. And then if you want to delete an employee for whatever reason, then you click on delete here. So this is what we call a Crud editor, right? Create, read, update, delete. So those four operations. Basically, if you create anything, if you create a CRUD, the CRUD methods for that object, then you are easily able to edit that object and change the attributes to that object or the entities within that object. So CRUD editors, that's an important principle which we may cover in future videos, but this add table method supports all that. So you see, add table editor, it does a lot of heavy lifting for us, right? With just these few lines of code, it's creating the selector, and you can see the selector is live. As we click here, it's changing the values here, and it's also creating for us the part that we can actually use to change the values. So it's done a lot of heavy lifting for us, and we need to be able to customize this. So the more we understand this add table editor, the more we can create very effective interfaces. And so you can see this is a very simple one. The employee table editor is quite a simple one, but if we look at the table editor for the companies, number one, we've separated where we put the selector. So the selector is there, and then we've shifted the form itself to here. And let's see what else goes on here. So that's the first thing. We've separated where the elements go, and here we are specifying the method for creating the selectors. So up here, when we specified table title and table body, we had done it explicitly as functions. Here we seem to be doing something very different. We are just specifying two strings, so company and base city. And you see the way that works is the code, the add table editor, is going to look up the type of thing you send into table name. So if you send a string in, then add table editor is going to assume that this is referencing a particular column. So it's going to assume that, yes, I should be getting a function, but it seems I've only gotten a string. Therefore, I conclude that the string is simply the column name. So, for example, in the earlier employee one, when we created the table body and we specified to return the email address of Vels, we could have replaced all this just by email. Right, so if we just specified the string email, then it would have the same result as creating a function that returned the email attribute of Vels. So if you like, this is a shorthand notation. If you know you don't want a more sophisticated string, right? This is a semi-sophisticated string because we want to include a comma and a space and position things this way, and we want to use two attributes. But if instead of that we want just one attribute on its own, then we can use this shorthand notation and just specify the field name, right? So that's how we create in the company's editor, we create the title and the body, right? So company and base city, and you can see here the company name and the city where the company is based. Okay, and then select action. So this is another attribute that we didn't have here. So in this case, when we selected in our employees list, when we selected any employee, then that just changed the values in the form. So that's a kind of already specified that that's the default action of the selector. And that will always be included in the actions taken when we click on the selector. But in the case of the companies list, we want to do more than this, than just change the values in the editor. So it is changing the values in the editor. But in addition to that, we want that when we click on the name of the company, that it's going to change the list of users. So we want to bring up the users or the employees of that company when we click on this company's list. So that's an additional action that needs to be taken. So the way that we create additional actions is using the select action attribute in Add Table Editor. So in that, we specify a set of actions, and we distinguish between the sets of actions using some attribute name. So here we've just chosen to call it show employees. You could have called this anything here. So you specify select action under the Add Table Editor, and then within select action, you can create you can create attributes which must be functions that tell you what to do when you've selected, when you've clicked on one of those entries. So these functions will accept the values behind the selection. So when we click here on BlackBerry, we know that that's going to send in a bunch of values. So it's going to send us everything that's in that row of entries. So we know that the companies have a company name and a base city. They also have an index IDX. So remember we said earlier that we have this IDX attribute. So let's just find that. I think we referenced it when we were creating the sample. Right, remember we said when we were creating our users list or our employees list, we wanted to generate a user ID, and that user ID also contained this, we wanted to use the index of that employee. So we use the IDX. IDX is automatically generated in our data set. So in most tables, you will have an index field that just helps you keep track of the row. So IDX is automatically generated in each data set. So what we are doing here is we are looking for the list of users. So when we click on a company name, that's going to create all the values for us. That's going to find all the values for that selection. And by the way, it's going to bring up more values than you see here. For example, if we had left out the base city, if this was just a list of company names, if we click on that, even though we can't see that city here, still that is going to enter here. So when we click on our selection, the set of values that come here will be all the values in that row. So it's going to have index, the company name, the base city, and whatever else there is in that row. So we know that we have the index for the company sitting behind this vels thing here, right? So that's an important thing to understand. So in your select action, that's going to specify what the system must do when the user clicks on a selection, and what it will do is provide us with an object that has all the attributes for that particular entry. So for this entry, we do have a company ID, right? So this is the index for the company, right? Remember, we are in the context of a company's editor. We are using the company's data set. So behind values will be the company data that's been chosen. So vals.index is the company ID. And now we know that when we created the employees list, each employee had a company ID, and that was just randomly generated. So if you go back to your init sample, your users have this company ID attribute, and that was just a random number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one of those. So we are working our way through all the users, all the employees. So here you can see the users list, and then the data, all the data sets have another method available, iterate to BM. So that method will run through all the rows and create an object, and it will help us create a new data set. So we want to pull out only those employees of the selected company. So we are running through all the rows in the employees table, and we are looking up to see which employee's company ID is the same as the currently selected company. Right? Remember, vals is the currently selected company, so the object for that. And then we are pulling up the index of that company. So we are looking to see which employee has the same company ID as the selected company. And so if it finds that there's an employee with that index, then it returns that employee. Otherwise, if that employee doesn't have the same company ID, then it returns false. And so the way this obj iterate to BM works is if it gets back a false, it ignores that entry. If it gets back a non-false, then it does add to the list that it's building up here. So now we have a new subset of data available, which is your list of employees. So now you have the list of employees for the selected company. And then it's saying here, if there is such a thing as employee editor, and remember here, when we created this editor for the users, we had referenced it. We created a reference employee ed. So when it checks whether employee ed, when it checks whether that exists, it finds out yes, it does exist. So it will go in here, and then we say employee ed show entries employees. So employees is the sublist of users, sublist of employees that we just created. And then we are drawing on the show entries method. So show entries is from our table editor. So you see when we created the table editor, right? So here's our editor. Then that editor is going to contain a bunch of methods, and show entries is one of those methods. And when you run show entries, that will go ahead and draw out, it will update this list here, your list of selectors. It's going to update that list. So we are saying here, look up the company ID, find the employees of that company, and then show that list in the employee editor. So update the employee editor and show just this list of employees for this company. So that's how that works. And I know it's a fair amount to process here, but once you understand this, and you see it's quite compact, which can sometimes be a dangerous thing, but if you understand the bits and pieces to this, you will be able to create this fairly sophisticated action. And you see virtually all our operations, all our data comes down to understanding how to cross-connect pieces of data. So this is an extremely powerful ability to have, right? The ability to create a table editor and to be able to customize it, to position things properly, to create the selector well, and to take appropriate action when something is selected, right? The ability to influence another table editor is a very powerful thing, and it can be used to build very effective interfaces. And you can imagine you can stack this as much as you like. You can cross-connect as many tables as you want, And because you have this powerful layout possibility, you have powerful layout options. You can really create, even though you have many cross-connected data sets, you can still manage that well and create an easy-to-use interface. So that's what we are. That's basically what we wanted to cover in this. Just looking a bit further, you also find that sometimes it's useful to make available all the raw data that's in the data set. And sometimes you do that just to check that your system is working correctly. So I did add down here that I've added table editors for users and companies, and that's stuck in the raw data accordion tab. So if you go down here under raw data, you can see here's your users list, and if you don't specify the table body, then it's going to just give you the whatever's in that entry. So it's giving us the whole object here. So you can read through this and you can cross-check whether the editor is operating correctly by looking at this. So you can say, okay, this guy Wilson, Noah Wilson, is with company 1, and then you can go down to the companies list. So here's the companies list, and number 1 is Amazon. So is Wilson correctly identified as being part of Amazon? And if we go here under Amazon, you can see Wilson there. So you can, so obviously the add table editor has already been tested, but you might be creating some other new methods, and having access to the raw data is always a useful thing to see if it's operating correctly. So that's it. That's how we can create data and create interfaces to data, and create fairly sophisticated interfaces.